The Airstrike campaign has dropped and is making a big splash in World of Warships Legends. Are you new to the game or a surface ship veteran looking to get a head start and improve your results in the brand new aircraft carrier game mode? In this episode of Shots, we'll tell you why torpedo bombers are the highest impact weapon for new carrier players and show you how to get more hits, maximize your damage output, and win more games as you rain death from above. Hello, VannKraken here, 4-year World of Warships player and World of Warships Legends alpha tester. After posting our last video on my first ever exploits in a carrier in 4 years of World of Warships, I'd started jotting down some thoughts about my first handful of games onto a post-it note with some of the key points to focus on that really jumped out at me with regard to gameplay in this new mode. Ironically, the very next day, I got a great YouTube comment from subscriber Higher Nation that had some additional tips and thoughts, and it really pushed me to drill down a little deeper into carrier gameplay and detail what I think is the best attack weapon for new players, the torpedo bomber. Let's visit our Torpedo Bomber Intelligence Report to help explain why these planes are a solid attack option for players who are either new to World of Warships Legends or just new to the carrier gameplay style like myself. So torpedo bombers have several advantages over dive bombers. First off, their entire attack run is performed at a lower altitude and a shallower approach than a dive bomber, so it makes them easier to aim because you can keep your targets in visual reference for the entire attack run. Secondly, you get more time for your drop, about 10 or 12 seconds, which is literally double the time that you have to execute a dive bomb drop. And lastly, torpedoes offer consistent alpha damage. Each torpedo hit is going to provide a good solid amount of alpha strike, and it's also going to give the bonus damage of a flood chance. While you can get great results with either the torpedo bombers from the Imperial Japanese Navy Hosho or the US Navy Langley, there are some distinct differences between the aircraft that mirror the development trends of these airplanes between the period of World War I and World War II with the Tier 3 aircraft that we'll highlight here. US aircraft were generally more durable than Japanese aircraft, and you see in bold that there's more hit points for the planes from the Langley than from the Hosho. But that's going to be the only advantage for the US planes. Japanese planes were faster, they were more maneuverable, and Japanese torpedo technology was really the gold standard from an aerial torpedo perspective. So Japan's going to get the nod on maximum speed, detectability range, and maximum torpedo damage. Now, we don't have the stats released on the Tier 5 carriers yet, but we could expect that similar trends will hold at Tier 5. Without further delay, let's talk about 10 tips that'll help you become a better torpedo bomber player. We're going to lay these out in 3 attack phases. Think of the first as the pre-drop or approach phase. Basically, what target vector do we select to approach a target, and how do we come up with that target in the first place? Secondly is the actual drop itself. We're going to get friendly with the term the aiming cone, which has to do with the accuracy of our drop. And lastly, we're going to talk about the exit period or exit phase. After we drop our torpedo, how do we choose to exit the area to minimize anti-aircraft attack and set up our next victim? We've launched our planes, they're in the air, and we've entered the approach phase of our attack. The first tip or consideration at hand is choosing an appropriate target, and this is probably our most complicated thing to do overall. We have to weigh the anti-air strength of the targets we're attacking, the type of ship, whether it's piloted by a bot or a human, and the level of threat it presents, either to our own ship or perhaps our cap. The minimap is going to be our friend in helping to sort all this out, so let's take a deeper look. There's a lot of factors to consider when we're selecting targets, which can make it very confusing for newer players or players new to CVs. So let's break this down from left to right, moving from less complicated to more complicated. So first off, in a perfect world, we can keep everything simple, right? So we'd look for ships controlled by a bot, which are more predictable in their patterns. We'd look for a ship type that's less maneuverable and not as speedy, like a battleship. We'd look for a ship that's isolated and or weak with regard to its anti-aircraft protection. If it's alone, we can single it out and hunt it down like a lion going after that sick or old wildebeest that got separated from its buddies. And lastly, we look for a ship that's relatively nearby. If we have to fly halfway across the map or all the way across the map, we're going to be spending more time flying than dropping our torpedoes. Unfortunately, games imitate life and that things are rarely as simple as we would like them to be. So how do we deal with situations that are harder if we have to? Well, we might have to prioritize a human target, which is going to have a better chance by far of avoiding our torpedo strike by changing speed and direction. Or we might have another type of ship that we have to attack. There might not be a slower battleship readily available, so we have to go after a cruiser or a destroyer that's faster and more nimble. We also might have to attack a ship that isn't weak and isolated. It might have strong anti-aircraft guns like a Texas, or ultimately when we play higher tiers like a Baltimore. Or it might be bubbled up, grouped together with other ships that multiply the force of their anti-aircraft power and make entering that zone very difficult. Lastly, we might have to attack ships that are farther away and, again, put us on a longer flight path that takes us away from dropping our weapons and puts us into idle time. But obviously, if you can do the left-hand column, the keeping it simple, do that first, choose those criteria first. If those are not present, then go to the harder options. But there's an override to all of this. If there's a ship close enough to your CV to spot or attack you, you need to go after it no matter what it is, no matter how hard it is to attack, because your ship is under imminent threat. And secondly, if your base is under attack and you're going to lose the game on points, you obviously have to go after a ship entrenched in your base, even if it's a difficult target to eliminate. So we've done the difficult part of the approach phase, which is to choose an appropriate target. Now we're going to put our second tip forward, which is to plan our approach flight. So from greater than 5 kilometers away, we need to plot a course for our torpedo bomber that will intercept the target ship slightly ahead of its current path. So if we look at this visually, the approach flight from roughly 5 to 8 kilometers away from this target battleship is really important because we make our big course corrections here that ultimately puts us on as straight a possible line to get to the enemy battleship in the final part of our flight. So that again, when we reach the enemy ship, we're positioned slightly ahead of it when we drop our torpedoes. So our third tip in the approach phase is knowing that you actually have to physically trigger your attack run. So this is going to use your controller, either RT or R2, and at a distance of approximately 2 to 5 kilometers. I'd call this a medium distance. The very cool thing is we get more room and time to line up this final approach of the torpedo attack run than we do with a dive bomber attack run. Jumping back to our diagram, we've taken our approach flight, which is roughly 5 to 8 kilometers from the enemy ship, to do our big course corrections. We manually trigger the attack run with RT or R2 at a distance of about 2 to 5 kilometers from the enemy ship, and that will cause 2 of our planes to break off and descend, or 1 if you only have 1 remaining. And again, we want to remain on as straight a possible attack line to the target at this point. So once we hit R2, RT on our controller, we've entered the heart of the torpedo bomber attack, called the drop phase in my made-up vernacular. Tip 4 tells us again to minimize turning on the final approach. We've said this a couple times and we're going to be a broken record here. The more settled we are, the less we turn in that final approach in the last 2 to 5 kilometers to the enemy ship. the more a wide aiming cone keeps narrowing and narrowing to become a skinny rectangle with 2 parallel tracks for your torpedoes instead of a wide-looking V. In visual terms, keep that final approach, which can be up to 14 seconds long, as straight and narrow as possible, and your aiming cone will shrink down to 2 parallel boxes. But if we swerve in this last approach, that aiming cone will widen and our torpedo aim will get thrown off. This is an issue that I had no clue I was doing wrong when I first started playing. I didn't know why the cone was big. I didn't know why it was only a rectangle in other approaches. And it's all about remaining steady on the final approach. So our aiming cone will either be a tight parallel rectangle or a wide V based on the number of turns we've tried to make on our final approach. And the bottom line is we have to visualize torpedo paths in that cone when we get to the enemy ship, knowing that torpedoes are going to follow the outside edge of the lines in the cone. RNG is not magically going to fix bad aim. We're going to have a wide track if our final approach has been turny, and we're going to have a nice tight parallel track if our final approach has been straight and smooth. What tip 5 tells us visually is that when we have a straight and narrow approach path, like on the right-hand side of this panel, we get 2 parallel torpedo tracks that are tight, and both torpedoes have a great chance of hitting our target. But if we've been janky in our approach, the left-hand side shows that the 2 torpedoes will follow the outside edges of the aiming cone, and here we probably should just settle for getting one of the 2 torpedoes on target. Make a final adjustment to make sure one of those arrows is going to lead the enemy ship properly, because it's going to be really hard to hit both. Now, I personally had a really hard time at first with tip number 6, which is don't drop late. A few hours after the patch, Wargaming came out with a carrier quick start guide which showed you that you needed to press R2 or RT a second time before the timer runs out or before you're too close to the enemy ship for your torpedoes to have room to arm. It's pretty overwhelming when you're a new player or new to carriers, and it's hard to keep track of everything going on your final approach. We already talked about the straight tracks that your torpedoes will take when you have good aim. But besides lining up your shot, you also have to pay attention to the number to the right of your aiming cone, which is your drop timer. That can't reach 0 or you will abort your attack run. And then the yellow zone of the aiming cone is also something that's called the arming distance. So that yellow zone cannot overlap the enemy ship, or the torpedo warheads will not have time to arm before they hit the enemy ship and basically give you a dud hit and no explosion and no damage. Well, with tip 6, we've actually completed all the vital elements of a torpedo bombing run. But let's add 2 quick considerations to the drop phase that will help make our runs even more accurate. The first is to lead moving targets with a simple rule of thumb. In visual terms, tip 7 shows us how we can make fine adjustments on our final approach and adjust our lead at the drop point so that we think in terms of ship lengths. So for battleships, which aren't the fastest, we'll lead ahead of the ship by about 1/4 ship length while it's moving. Cruisers, which are going to have an uptick in speed versus a battleship, can be led on average by about 1/2 ship length. And destroyers, which range from fast to faster, can be led by about 3/4 to 1 complete ship length at the drop point. While our simple rule of thumb is going to work great for ships moving at a constant speed in a straight line, tip 8 reflects on the fact that as we get to higher tiers and play more human players with more maneuvering skills, we're going to have to make adjustments for turning targets. And that's where we can start to think like a DD player or destroyer player. Our torpedo bomber is definitely a plane and not a ship, but we can draw on our experience when we've captained destroyers to figure out how to adjust our aim when enemy ships are turning in our attack run. If an enemy ship turns in, we'll have to aim slightly to the left of the mark of our aiming cone based on our simple rule of thumb. And when an enemy ship turns out, or away, we'll actually have to adjust a little bit to the right of our aiming point to compensate for those turns. Now, the amount that we adjust our aim will depend on the speed and agility of the enemy ship, but again, if we think and draw on our DD skills, we can make these adjustments and get more hits when enemy ships are evasive. Tips 1 through 3 in the approach phase and tips 4 through 8 in the drop phase will give you all the arrows in your quiver that you need to be a successful torpedo bomber pilot. However, there's 2 remaining bonus tips that will really increase the amount of damage and overall results in XP and silver that you can expect with using this type of weapon. Our 2 bonus points both involve plotting out optimal flight paths in real time. Tip number 9 involves planning an exit route on your attack runs that do not take you directly over additional ships besides the ship that you're attacking. If you look in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, you can see our torpedo bomber wants to line up on an enemy cruiser, but it's accompanied by a neighboring battleship. Each of those ships is surrounded by what's called an AA or flak bubble, and in this case, those 2 bubbles overlap. Our flight path will make a big difference with regard to how much damage our planes take on this attack run from anti-aircraft fire. If we swing to the right, we're going to fly into both bubbles, take massive damage, and probably be returning to the carrier immediately. But if we exit to our left, we'll only take fire from the cruiser, avoid the flak of the battleship, and our planes will hopefully all or mostly survive the initial drop. And our final tip, tip number 10, is a way to deliver massive damage to an isolated target like a battleship. It's linking attacks. In the lower right-hand corner of the screen, we see our torpedo bomber lining up its aiming cone on a battleship for an initial drop. Now, if we fly past that battleship after we drop and open up some distance from the ship after the attack, we can actually loop around and perform another consecutive drop, getting off not just 2, but 4 torpedoes. As long as we haven't taken massive anti-aircraft fire, we can actually link that attack one more time and get 3 consecutive attacks in one, basically using an S pattern to link those drops and again deliver major and hopefully catastrophic damage and floods to that battleship that will knock it out of commission. And in summary, tips 9 and 10 represent our exit or post-drop phase that get us bonus damage and results by helping us avoid damage from a bubble of multiple ships, which can knock our planes out of the sky and make us fly back and forth between the carrier more often. And then the second scenario, linking attacks to really deliver a wallop to an isolated target like a battleship and hopefully get them off the map and out of the game. I hope these 10 tips can help your torpedo bombing game as much as they've helped mine. I've been able to go from just getting a handful of hits, maybe 4 or 5 per game, to netting 17 torpedo hits in my best game with Langley so far. A couple ships destroyed, and then again, lobbing extra damage on top of that with some floods, in this case 3. If you have a chance, post your scores in the video comments below or find the link to the VannKraken Gaming Discord server and post some pictures there. It'd be awesome to see if you've found these tips of value and if they've helped you, again, the same way that they've helped me. Well, I hope by now it's pretty clear that torpedo bombers are a great tool for new players in World of Warships Legends or new to World of Warships Legends carrier play to master. If you look at my first video, which is a first look at the Airstrike campaign, you will see how horrendous I was in my first game and how these tips have actually helped me improve quite a bit. Again, I want to give a special shout out to Hire Nation, our subscriber who left a great post with some of these tips and really helped push me to get my thinking together and put this video together on Torpedo Bomber Play. And also, thank you to the folks at the World of Warships Wiki and to Wargaming themselves for their quick start carrier guide. If you like this video, you don't have to smash or smack anything. Just check out the rest of our content here on YouTube or catch us live streaming on Twitch. Hey, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I am VannKraken and I am out.